Hey, I'm Roy Harmon, and today on the Hot Pursuit podcast, we're joined by John Gross, the founder and CEO of Fat Earth Media. Thanks for joining us, John.
Hey, Roy. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm really excited to be here and chat through some creative stuff today.
Yeah, so John is going to talk to us about creative strategy and how to integrate your creative strategy into the media buying process. So before we get started, John, maybe you could kind of walk us through why that's so important in the first place.
Yeah. Well, like I said, thanks for having me. I'm really excited today to kind of have this conversation. I think it's one of those functions of a well-run direct consumer brand or well-run business in general that I think is evolving very rapidly. And the reason I think it's so important is because of that evolution. I think if we think back to the early days of Facebook, particularly the early days of direct to consumer and e-commerce, we got a little bit complacent with the type of creative that we were running, right? You could think about these very specific type of direct response advertisements where you put a picture of your product and you tell people what the value proposition is. Maybe you're just listing the literally as basic as the calorie content saying buy me. And those still have a very specific place in a brand's repertoire across their creative assets. However, the bigger brands who are spending more money at scale, the brands who are trying to be a little bit less commoditized, the brands that are really thinking long term are have a desire and a necessity to be more branded, to be a little bit more nebulous, and to focus more on big picture brand strategy. And I think why those two concepts are so important is because you can't be overly successful through the kind of standard digital marketing channels without really understanding both ends of the spectrum. And typically what we see is most brands who are advertising heavily on Facebook, for example, are doing one or the other really well, and they don't really know how to combine the process of brand with direct response advertising. So that's kind of the basis of our agency's thesis of, how to do creative really well, is that middle ground is really where you can really find the types of assets that can satisfy your business objectives the best.
So how does that start? Like what's the first stage when it comes to conceptually figuring this out and how to put this puzzle together?
So the first stage, I think, is to really acknowledge for any brand that they potentially have a gap in their understanding of their own creatives. So typically what we see, like on one end of the spectrum, you've got very basic kind of bottom of the barrel table stakes types of creatives like we just mentioned. Typically what I hear when I go to audit a brand and a brand is leveraging that type of asset, what I hear from the founders is something similar to this. Hey, we've got some ads in our account that appear to be working. They're driving some results. We're getting decent sales. However, when I look at the content, when I see the ads library, or I get served an asset out in the wild, as a founder, it makes my skin crawl a little bit. I don't like seeing it out there. We've all experienced those assets. And I'm not here to disparage them. There's a place for them. They work, they do drive results. And as a performance marketer myself, like I would be crazy to discount the effectiveness of those types of assets. On the other side of the coin, something that we hear that's a bit unfortunate is a founder will come to me or come to our agency and say, "You're going to love it. We just spent $200,000 working with this production studio, and they gave us 2 videos, 4 GIFs, and 10 polished statics." And we look at those assets and we say, "Man, these are beautiful. These are really cool, but they're probably not going to work on the marketing channels that sustain your business's growth." And so what we see in the market and we see strategically is that that's really most commonly the two ends of the spectrum. You've got very, very specific direct response strategies and actions being taken on one end, and you've got this really beautiful high production value, very expensive creative being made on the other end. And what we don't see a lot is the combination of those two things. And for far too long, I think that ad buying and creative have been thought of as two separate strategies, two separate disciplines, and certainly have been thought of as two separate line items from a brand's, yearly budget. And so where I think this starts is really understanding where on the spectrum you want to be as a brand, right? And so depending on what kind of product you're selling, depending on the average order value, depending on the strength of your brand, depending on the level of education required, depending on if you're VC funded or what your goals are, you're going to need to kind of calibrate where you want to fall on that spectrum. And what I mean by that is running 100% raw user generated content may work great for one brand and one product type. It may not work so well for another brand or another product type. And so what we find is that like by bringing those two groups together, this very analytical, typically the ad buyer, the media buyer, or the growth manager, and someone like a creative director together, and giving them both very specific instructions and directions on how you want your creative to look, feel, and perform is the first place to start, and giving everybody a really clear understanding of what you need your creative to achieve. And then having those two groups really come together and discuss what's going to work and why. And so what we want to do is like really understand how can we make something perform really well, but also satisfy bigger brand objectives. And it's a difficult thing to do. And until you really start to bring those two groups together, it's almost impossible. And we just typically see that, a standard operation or standard model for a direct to consumer brand is I've got a media buyer or an agency running my ads on a weekly or biweekly basis. They're probably reporting to me a little bit about what works. Here's a few assets that are working. The internal marketing manager then goes to their graphic designer or their creative agency and says, we need more lifestyle. Well, it's our position that like, that's not nearly enough detail or subtlety. And 90% of what's actually going on in the ad account is being lost in translation. Not to mention that group is also just going to go off and create net new assets, funnel them back to the ad buyer, who's then going to test through those assets. And you end up with a bit of a random, less intentional workflow where a lot of things are being missed. So the subtleties of the assets aren't getting carried across in the testing. And then what's being tested is just a product of what's being developed, not necessarily the other way around. So I think conceptually, let me know if I'm getting a little bit too high level, but that's really kind of the starting point of what I think brands really need to be thinking about when it comes to creative testing is how can I close the loop on the speed at which we test, and how can I really close the loop on sharing of information?
Zooming in a little bit, then, how does that look for Fat Earth Media when you're doing that? What's the process like for your clients?
So, I mean, this is one of those things that the more I say it out loud, the more it appears like it should be very obvious. But like, show me a bunch of meetings or find me a bunch of rooms where the media buyer and the creative director are in the same room. Like it's as simple as that. Start there, right? Have the conversations in real time. And so what we do is we actually have kind of a very specific type of report. And I can talk a little bit later about what types of things we look for in what is a successful ad. And so our goal in this process that we've developed is to harvest as much information from our ad buyers, our media buyers, our growth managers as possible in order to give the honest frame of reference and context of the ad account through the perspective of those ads, and deliver that in real time to our creative director and invite them to debate and collaborate on what is working and why it's working. So for example, media buyers like myself, we have maybe a limited vocabulary. And so if I review creative across some period of time for a brand, I'm going to tell you, hey, Roy, like the UGC works, the lifestyle assets work, maybe I can get a little bit better than that. But when Savannah, my creative director, looks at that same group of assets, the level of granularity with which she can pick out the common details of what works and what doesn't is 100 times better than what I do. So that's the give and take. It's my role in this is to come to this meeting or come into this process with a lot of really good context on the actual assets themselves. Savannah would have no idea how to get into the Facebook account and sort through the data to understand what's working and what's not, but I can. And I'm actually not really well equipped to define and describe what is working and what's not. Right? I can only take it so far. So that's our role. Is like my job is to set this up, to tee up the story, to really get everyone to understand what's working and what's not, and then to have the creative team go through and pick out the real implications or start to define it. And so we actually go through and we tag everything. So it'll be, for example, unboxing, or depending on the type of business or type of brand, the type of product, we will actually come up with our own tagging system that makes sense for that product. If it's a food-based product, maybe it's like recipe or unboxing or things like that. That's very specific to the product. So when we run through it, we're starting to catalog and take note of what continuously works and what continuously doesn't work. And so that's kind of how we do that process. And so what we actually do is we put together a pretty lengthy deck. And depending on the amount of money that a client is spending or that an account is spending, it will require a different cadence. But on the extreme end, we're meeting every other week. Typically, we're meeting once a month and we're reviewing all of the creative in the account. We're taking screenshots or leveraging some software to build very specific reports on top spenders, top ROAS, top click-through rate, all the kind of indicating metric or leading metrics that you'd want to see. And then our media buyers run through the presentation and give our creative team a real sense of the context of what's working and what's not. Our creative team brings some inspiration to that call. So here are things we're seeing that we think would really mesh up with the brand. Where does our inspiration line up with what's really working? And then we actually collaborate in real time, and that becomes the creative brief. So it's very nuanced. We'll bring into that conversation. Like I really push our media buyers to say, what does the account need? Do we need to improve click-through rate? Do we need to improve top of funnel, middle funnel, bottom funnel, whatever it may be? And then we can really focus on those types of assets and figure out what metrics we're trying to improve. Because as well as I do, like if we're just trying to improve the click-through rate, there's a very different type of creative that we're going to put out the door than if we need to increase the ROAS of our remarketing efforts. Those are very different conceptually. So I think just really, it's subtle, but it's interesting. Just having that conversation with both groups at the table and present can make a huge difference. And I would challenge that, like, most brands just don't put enough time into their creative. And I don't mean the execution of it. I mean the strategy. Like, find me a bunch of brands who are really spending hours a month, hours a week reviewing and, picking through and analyzing the creative and why it's working and why it's not. Most brands just have creative on a retainer and they're getting net new assets and they're put into the account. And then we use hindsight to see what worked. And that's better than not doing that. But the next phase is really like making it one cohesive process where you have hypotheses based on the data, you execute against it, and then you test them in a really foundational and fundamentally sound way.
What do you look for in a creative director to find somebody who's able to operate in this sort of a system where you're not going to just go off to your room and do your thing? We're going to really work together, and it's a more collaborative process.
Yeah. Frankly, it's really difficult. I look for someone who is willing to understand what makes a good asset perform well, because typically, and this is a broad generalization, so I hope no one gets mad at me, but generally creative directors and designers and brand folks are unwilling to make any type of concessions in order to achieve performance goals. And that's where, like earlier, I was talking a lot about the calibration of your creative. And that's where the tone really has to be set by the brand. And so quite often we'll go into an early conversation with a brand and say, like, hey, look, we really think you need to ease up on these types of absolute rules. And if we're not able to kind of loosen the reins and take a few shots here with the brand, with the assets, and kind of like you need to be a little bit less precious, then we're probably not going to have the firepower that we need to really have performance. And so when you think about a creative director, really taking the time to bring them into your world of performance marketing and say, hey, the reason that we're running some of these assets that aren't the most subjectively beautiful is because we need performance as well. And like getting on the same page with that is really important from the outset. But honestly, like, we joke, and my team is probably tired of hearing me say this, but like when you hear Caitlin or Savannah and myself arguing about something, that's probably like where the good stuff is, because I'm a media buyer. Like I am, let's get it out the door. Let's test it. Let's run it. And they're the voice in the room that's like, hey, we have a longer term strategy that we need to work towards. And when we're kind of debating where we're going to land, that's usually the best type of asset. It's a bit direct response. It's a bit branded. So, I think it really takes a little bit of checking your ego at the door, because we both think we're right. And so when it comes to picking a good creative director, it's somebody that's going to be willing to roll their sleeves up, really try to get to learn what makes an account perform, and is willing to make those concessions where necessary. But it's tricky because you don't want them just to come in and just be, executing what the media buyer wants. So it does require a healthy, mature relationship between those two people. But I think once you see the process play out, and I'll tell you this, like when you find a creative director or a graphic design team, when you find ones that are good, you get them into this process and you start seeing the performance improve. It's such a good feeling. Like people get so excited and you get that little hit and you get that little test of like, okay, we made that concession and it worked. Let's do more of that. And I think like by really showing those teams the value in the work they're doing, and not just the value from people's reactions or the value in like the tangible nature of the asset, but the actual return on investment value, it's very impactful. And I think like that's a big part of this process too, is, early in my career, it would be a struggle for me to get brands to spend a couple $1,000s to invest in creative, but they were spending $50K a month into the platform. And I think like what I'm really trying to do is be an advocate for the creatives of the world and say like, look, you shouldn't just be paying all this money for media buying or into the platform. Like the creative, it is the single thing that drives success. And to think about the paid media and the creative as two totally different things and two totally different budgets, I think is it's very short-sighted. So yeah, I think the creative director has got to be able to make some concessions, but really have an opinion as well.
What sort of guidance do you give clients when they're trying to decide how much of their resources to allocate towards that more direct response sort of a campaign versus branding?
Yeah. So first of all, like it's always changing, right? So as your business grows, there's going to be some inflection point throughout your growth curve where you're going to need to invest more money in brand. And so if you're a young company with a really good product market fit and a large addressable audience, you're going to be able to effectively run nothing but direct response style ads and get good efficiency. The trick, where it comes from experience, is being able to read the cues in the data to know that you're starting to slow down, to know that you're starting to hit some ceiling of scale, and being disciplined enough to start investing in brand at that moment, not until it's too late. And I think that's a really difficult thing, particularly for younger founders or for brands who are in a shoestring budget to do that, right? So you're essentially saying, well, we're still getting 2x ROAS in the account. For example, why would I start to invest in bigger picture branded top of funnel creatives? And it's my opinion that eventually that's going to run out. You're going to hit some laws of diminishing return. You're going to hit some ceiling. And if you're waiting until then to start really building the upper funnel, to build the brand, to serve more impressions, you're going to have kind of this period of time where you fall off and it's really difficult. And you get kind of on this hamster wheel of not being able to drive consistent returns on ad spend. And then it becomes even more difficult to find the funds to invest in that brand. Um, Also, too, like the type of product makes a big difference. The average order value makes a big difference. Just, thinking there's obviously a lot of exceptions to this, but if you've got a very expensive product, you're going to need to invest most likely more into bigger, better creative. If you're in a market where there's like a high degree of commoditization, right? If you think about some food products or things that could potentially be copied easily, then if the long term goal is to be the trusted source, the trusted brand, the trusted version of that particular product, then I think it stands to reason that you're going to need to continue to invest in brand. Also, for brands who have goals of omni-channel distribution, Amazon, retail, etc., I think it's smart to think about investing in more heavily branded content early, because you have other business objectives, right? The things you're doing on Facebook, for example, are definitely influencing your customers' behavior in other channels. We see this all the time with, the way we do post-purchase surveys for some of our clients. We see people buying online one week, and then, well, maybe not 1 week, but 1 month online, 1 month in store, depending on where they live. And to really understand that omni-channel interaction with your customer is incredibly important. That's another good reason to invest more in brand. And then it really just depends on budgets, results, and kind of what's going on with the brand itself. But I would just say, like, typically it's earlier than you think, and going a bit bigger and better on your creative is almost never a bad idea.
So I know you've done this many times and have seen great results. Could you walk us through a campaign that offers a good example of sort of where to start and where things go and the kind of results that people can potentially see by using an approach like this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think maybe one of the best examples. So I was with Our Place, it's a cookware company out of Los Angeles. They do a lot more than cookware, but they're a really great brand. When they first launched, were actually a bit more on the brand side of creative, a bit more nebulous, a bit more storytelling, a lot less product focused when we first started working with them. And as we continued to test these creatives, we really started to see people engaging with and reacting to certain features of the product, right? It's nonstick. It had this really great pour spout. It had a steamer basket. There were a lot of really interesting value propositions that we weren't really hitting on. And so going through this process of putting the creatives down, going through them and actually categorize them and cataloging them gave us a really clear picture on what type of combination of brand, aesthetic, and value proposition was being well responded to. And, for like maybe the first 6 months, the results were good, but they weren't where we wanted them to be. And then finally, we kind of got to this idea of this really well branded, high production value, very aesthetically engaging asset, but that was at the core of it focused on nothing but the functionality. And so we really kind of married both of those things. And for Our Place, that particular video ended up totally breaking open their business and breaking open the ad account. And then we were able to really just leverage the bits and pieces of that video to kind of amplify them for the next 6 to 8 months. And so that process was very similar to what I was describing earlier, where we would actually, me and my team would actually come to the table with all of our creative recommendations. We would run through that with their creative director and their internal creative team. And then we would kick around and, it was like this healthy debate of what's working and what's not. And it was really important for me to say, look, I know you love this asset, but I'm looking at it in the account and it's not doing its job. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. Or, hey, we just launched this. I'm really excited about the early traction. And so just really keeping everybody on track and understanding what was performing and what wasn't. And then having that debate from the creatives and the things that they were able to pick out, we were able to get to the core of what their creative really needed to be. And then you can go out and make so many different versions of it, right? So now we're actually saying we fundamentally understand what it is about our creative that drives results. So now we're not necessarily shooting in the dark trying to come up with all these new concepts. What we're doing is looking for new executions of that same concept to knock that concept off. So then so once you kind of figure those things out, you're moving into this process of like, how do I balance evolutionary versus revolutionary creative? And conceptually, what I mean there is, if you have a winning asset, don't try to beat it right away with something totally different. Try to beat it with a similar version of that asset. Define that asset at its core and make more of those. That's evolutionary. It's going to be incremental. But that's going to give you longevity. If that first asset starts to fatigue, you can, confidently bet that the new one is going to perform similarly because it's the same concept. But you're always kind of keeping on the back of your mind, what can we do that's totally new? And again, like that'll be kind of up to your decision on how much time and energy you spend on that evolution versus that revolutionary type of concept. For them as well, like they ran and had amazing relationships with so many different influencers. And they were kind of the pioneer, and our agency really led they called it safe listing. It's the idea of like bringing creator avatars into your Facebook ad account and running ads through their likeness. So you're essentially leveraging their audiences and leveraging their credibility to sell your product. It's a really, really great strategy. At any given time, we were running like maybe 30 to 40 different creators across any individual month. So it was a lot of volume. And we just had all of this content. And at first, every creator would kind of just give us whatever they wanted, right? They would just get the product, they would enjoy it. And that's a good way to start because you don't necessarily want to bias it in one direction. But as you get volume and you start seeing how these creatives are rolling in, that review process, particularly of UGC, is incredibly important. So instead of us just saying UGC works, we got so granular that we could say, okay, it needs to be a female creator, age 25 to 35. They need to be looking directly into the camera. Here's the script. They need to be talking about the multi-purpose or the multi-feature attributes of the product. And they need to be holding the skillet in their hand right in front of the camera. If they don't do that, we just see a major decline in performance. Them cooking isn't as good. There's a lot of things that we realize like men just didn't at that time. Things have changed since then, but just that was like a real example. And the only way you get there is by going through that creative review process. And also too, like it also gives us the ability to say, how can we add branded elements into this exact same kind of like creative category? Because typically UGC is a bit of the Wild West. A lot of times you see brands run nothing but UGC. You kind of miss out on brand lift. You miss out on brand awareness because it's just a person. They tell you to buy a product. They're usually not even using the brand name. They're really just talking about the product. So a lot is lost. And when you go through this and you really understand like what it is about UGC that really moved the needle, then you can start to control the quality. You can control the script. You can control the content. And it just gives you, the ability to manage your expectations, the ability to dictate what type of creative you get. I think ultimately it's a much better customer experience, and it's going to make your ad account perform just so much better.
And when you're talking about knowing exactly who needed to be delivering the message, are you saying that you were able to discover that data through testing within the campaign, or was that based on some other research or maybe a combo of the two?
Yeah. So this was all data from the Facebook account. So this is, and we structured and still do structure the tests in a very specific way. Again, that depends on the account, depends on the budget, depends on a lot of different things. But again, like realistically, I see a lot of asset analysis that I don't think is very accurate, but really having that person in the ad account who can architect and then execute against an appropriate creative testing scheme is the first part of this. And then reading those out and saying, here's what's working, here's what's not, and then making additional hypothesis to continue to refine that answer is incredibly important. But again, like it's like you have to have the data to understand what assets are working. You have to have the creative direction or that creative insight to articulate the data, right? You can't just say these three assets work. You say these three assets work, and oh, by the way, they work because, right? I think that's a really key concept. It's like, it's not just the data, it's the data, how you read it out, how you brief that back in, and then how you retest it. It is that cycle that gives you the answer that you need.
Is there any technology or tools in particular that you feel are really helpful for people who are trying to implement this this methodology or this approach for the first time?
Yeah. So I would highly recommend when you're first starting this that you just spend a lot of time in the account itself and really get familiar with everything. Once you understand and if you feel like you're a really good media buyer and you're very familiar with the account, there's a great piece of software that I recommend everybody use. It's called Motion. It's the Motion app. I think it's Motion.app. And they've just got a really clean interface for connecting to the back end of the Facebook platform. It pulls in your creative data in a really effective, beautiful way. You can build custom reports. I think the thing though, the what I'm like, my team's been using it for a long time, and I routinely go through and make sure that there's like common sense behind it. And so like with any tool that gives you a shortcut to the data, whether it be Triple Whale or any type of reporting platform, I just think it's really important to understand the why behind the data request, because a lot of times it's not actually that hard to get the data. It's hard to understand the implications. And so whenever I recommend tools like this, the other edge of this double-edged sword is that by making it really easy to see the data, you may actually miss the realities of the account itself, just because you've got a couple of pre-populated dashboards. And it's not enough to go in there and look and say, Motion, show me the 3 highest click-through rate assets. Like that, just, you're kind of really removing a bit of that really critical substance that I was talking about by having that ad buyer be so intimately attached to the account and really understanding it, that some of these kind of front-end creative analytics tools can save someone like that a massive amount of time, but could be very dangerous in the hands of somebody who doesn't really understand the nuance and the art of ad buying. And there's a lot of people out there that are probably cringing when I say the art of ad buying, but I will take that to my grave. Like, of course there's some science, of course there's data, but the people who know, like it is certainly an art. And I think like I would highly recommend using Motion, but make sure that you're well equipped to understand what it's telling you, because it could easily lead you down a path that's not necessarily very productive.
And I got to ask, I feel like this is like a obligatory question now for just about every podcast in the world. AI, do you think that there's going to be a positive effect, a negative effect? Have you been able to use generative AI in any of your processes so far?
There's a couple really good use cases for it. First is brainstorming. I think that's the best use case for us right now. I am excited to see how AI can reduce the burden of executing some of these assets. I think we're still a really long ways away from AI giving us really thoughtful, forward thinking, and critical strategic recommendations. And again, like that's kind of the, if you leave here with anything, my perspective is that the strategy and the why behind any asset is much more important than the actual execution of the asset. So if we can continue to leverage AI to help us execute against what ordinarily would take a really long time, and we can shorten that process and reduce the cost of that ad or that asset, then that's really great. I think to answer the question in a little bit different way, I think where it can be dangerous is if brands think that they maybe can like upload their asset library, press a button, and have AI jumble out a bunch of different outputs. Because I mean, even, there are some really great tools for multivariate testing. I'm forgetting the name of it off the top of my head, but that's just not really our style. Like if you're a small brand and you don't really understand what's working and you upload a couple images and have, I think it's called Marpipe, you have it give you 60 iterations of those 3 images each. Mm-hmm. And they all 3 base images aren't performing well, then the iterations aren't going to perform well. And now you know that, I don't know, some hex code of yellow works better than some other hex code of yellow, but they all stink. And now you don't know anything. So I think there is an advantage, just like with any tool, and AI is certainly just right now, in my opinion, a tool. Leverage it for efficiency, but I think we're a ways away, and hopefully I'm right, from it replacing good critical thinking and good strategy.
Yeah, I don't see how it replaces, especially when you're talking about branding. I don't see how it's going to come up with something that's innovative when it's trained on existing data. How are you going to come up with so? And I mean, I know it can do some great things, and I love it. I love, I use it for tons of different things for brainstorming. It's great, but I don't think anybody needs to worry about quitting their day job or anything like that.
Look, I think there's and again, there's a real. I just had a conversation recently with someone. There still is a real use case. There's a time and place for like templated ads that you're grabbing inspiration and saying, look, we see that when we were working for Magic Spoon a long time ago, that the us versus them format was just so killer. Mm-hmm. And like at that given time, if you were a brand and you didn't just grab that as an inspiration and test it for your brand, you were missing out on something. So like, I think those types of things, AI, like look, here's a couple of top performers, here's a template, give me the version of it for this particular brand, run that quickly, have some cheap and dirty tests in your account as well. I think that's totally applicable. And I think that's like, again, hopefully we'll leave here kind of understanding that the whole point of what I'm saying is that this is a balance, right? There is a place and time for that quick hitting templated asset. And there's a place and time for really being critical and for thinking bigger picture.
It seems like the key is having somebody, whether it's somebody in-house or externally, or maybe it's a team, somebody who can actually look at it and see, okay, here is the time where we can use this tool, or here's the time where we need to be focused on this sort of strategy. And you've still got to have that brain to put things together and
totally
and make use of the efficiency. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people find you?
Yeah, Roy, thanks so much for having me. I think it's an important conversation. So thanks for giving me kind of a little bit of space to talk through it. Yeah, people can find me. I'm relatively active on LinkedIn. I actually don't know the full handle. I'm sure it's linkedin.com/John Gross. If you type my name in, type in Fat Earth Media on LinkedIn, you'll find me. Our website is fat-earth.com. We've got a little bit about us on there, some case studies and things like that. But there's also a contact form if anybody wants to chat. I'm always happy to take a review of people's creative, bring our creative director onto that call and kind of talk about what we're seeing across the industry and what we can do. So yeah, it's been a joy being here. And if anyone wants to look me up, I think LinkedIn or our website would be the best place.
All right, cool. And at some point you're starting a podcast too, right?
Yeah, I actually just started. I've conducted my first 2 episodes. I had the head of marketing from Bruce Bolt. It's a batting glove company based here out of Austin, and then Amy Keller from Climate Candy. She talked a lot about her company's mission and what they're doing to kind of fight climate change. We've got a really great lineup of guests coming, so I'm excited. Going to be interviewing brand founders, talking a lot about hospitality, about growth, about brand. So it should be a fun one.
Where can they find it?
We have not actually posted our first episode yet, but it's going to be on Spotify. It's called the Down to Earth Marketing Podcast, and I'd be happy to share the links with that.
Yeah, when the link comes out, send it my way. We'll put it on the blog and the show notes so everybody can find it.
I will do the same for yours. Thank you.